Hey guys, I'm Ted and I'm here to give you another lecture, and for this lecture we're going to discuss industrial labor. Now before we begin our lecture proper, I like to do a customary recap and simply touch on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in the last lecture, we wrapped up our discussion on the transcontinental railways. We discussed how the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific met at Promontory Point in Utah, and how the completion of that line fundamentally altered the Republic. It allowed Birmingham to become a major steel producer, as the nation in general has all of the nation's industries sort of came together to fuel the completion of the railway. We discussed how national marketing rose has the nation's major industries sort of scrambled to establish themselves in far off and distant territories. The diet of the republic was fundamentally altered. Has fruits that were once only eaten at a particular time of the year can now be enjoyed throughout the year with the improvements to refrigeration. All goods, even most perishable goods, could be transported within days. To distant markets. And also, we discussed how the railways influenced the development of the early domestic tourism industry by popularizing sites in the Sierra Nevadas that would later become popular ski destinations. And also the Grand Canyon. Such locations were popularized by the railways, had the means of boosting their own revenues. And now, with that being said, I like to jump right into industrial labor and the many challenges that that both groups, the industrialists and the laborers, had to go through, or were subject to, I should say. So labor in the United States had a very peculiar history, and we'll discuss more on labor in a later lecture. But labor had a very peculiar history in the United States. There has always been a struggle to maintain an appropriate balance between as it relates to labor. Now, early labor union movements in the United States never attained the degree of prominence that it did elsewhere, namely in the United Kingdom, where the labor unions became extremely powerful and created a political party of their own. The Labour Party in the United Kingdom, rose to play a critical role in British politics during the 20th century. Now, the labor unions in the United States remained small, weak, and non-political for the most part. Workers in the United States did earn higher wages and enjoyed higher rates of social mobility than those in the United Kingdom. And this was mainly because at scale production increased face-to-face interaction between workers and employers shrank. Workers became relegated to merely production cost. Old workplace traditions like Saint Monday, or the habit of workers reading or workers reading to each other during a rotation during the week ended with mass industrialization. These things were possible. The old workplace habits and traditions, they were possible as long as work was done in a workshop environment. But had the efficiency increased, has efficiency obsessed employers like Carnegie and Rockefeller introduced more machinery and direct oversight, such traditions evaporated. Now, in the United States, the workforce tended to be non-homogeneous and comprised of unrelated individuals. This did not stop them from coming together during strikes. An interesting observation regarding pre-Civil War strikes, and even civil strikes in the years immediately following the Civil War, is that will be that the workers tended to equate their struggle with their employers, with the colonist struggle with King George in the British Parliament. They saw themselves as fighting back against tyranny. When shoemakers in Lynn, Massachusetts, when they decided to strike, they did so on Washington's birthday, and they did so to link Washington in particular with their cause. When railroad workers decided to condemn the Erie Railroad Company, they described the company as the King George of the working man. Now, conditions in the United States overall favored workers. This is why they were paid more than their contemporaries in other nations. And there were a number of reasons why they were able to receive higher wages, why conditions favored them. One condition was that land was plentiful in the United States, and the population was relatively low. It was comparatively low to other European nations. For those living in the United States or had the opportunity to make it to the United States, the option of becoming a landowner via the Homestead Act of 1862 was always there. To dissuade workers from heading out west or heading out to the countryside, employers had to offer higher wages to miners and to factory workers. Now, working conditions were far from ideal, but the pay was enticing and drew in large amounts of immigrants. Now, the immigrants were mainly from Southern and Eastern European, with sizable Japanese and Chinese communities along the Pacific coast. To show just how immigration impacted businesses, at the Carnegie plant, at the Central Carnegie plant, 1,100 of the 14,000 workers were from Southern and Eastern Europe. Many immigrants, however, viewed their working class status as temporary. They like their American contemporaries, they viewed their working class status as temporary. They felt that being factory workers and miners was a temporary condition, and that they did not need to lobby for better wages because they would soon leave the working class or the peasantry and become middle class citizens. They would join the middle class. Now, employers played on ethnic tensions in the workforce, and they did so to hinder unionization, and they played on these tensions by exploiting ethnic prejudices. Now, this was done by turning old stock Americans who were of British and German origin against Southern and Eastern European immigrants, particularly against Catholic immigrants. Now, the old stock Americans supported their bosses for ethnic reasons, and they did not associate with the immigrants, with their immigrant co-workers, even though they had more class reasons in common with them. Now, the old stock workers were used as foremen and managers in these plants. And a fierce antipathy between the English and the Irish was also exploited. They have historic grievances between those two groups. And shrewd employers often despised the immigrants, but also used the immigrant workers to their advantage. They often were the ones who taught the immigrants, the new immigrants, English. These immigrants were formerly agricultural peasants, and they had no working knowledge of English. The factory managers, the factory owners, they often taught them how to read the clock. They taught them common job phrases. They taught them how to listen for the whistles in the factories. And they basically acclimated them to a 6-day work week. Basically, this was instilling the industrial discipline into these workers. And this was jarring for the immigrants. As I stated earlier, these immigrants were agricultural peasants. They were used to saint days being observed. They were used to celebrations, large-scale communal celebrations that had to be scaled back. Celebrations such as the Polish weddings and so forth. Polish weddings were known to last about 5 days, or even the Jewish circumcision brisk ceremony, which had to be which is to be observed 8 days after the birth of a son. It now had to be scheduled around work hours. Now, unions also felt the pinch by having to meet the demands of engaging and mobilizing a large and linguistically diverse workforce. It was very difficult, and indeed, it was a very difficult environment to try to build a sense of trust and cohesion. Unions often had to hold their meetings in Yiddish, Italian, Polish, German, and English. Now, this made the meetings go very slow and with a very laborious process. The old stock employees were also horrified by the actions of some of their immigrant workers, like the Slavic coal miners who in Avella County, Pennsylvania, when they were on strike, they discovered that a mining boss, a man named George Rabish, had been spying for the management. When they found that out, they seized the man, they beat him, and they crucified him. This left the old stock employees just in utter shock. They were very much taken aback, very much in disbelief that the Slavic workers did that. Now, not all the immigrants had the intention of staying in the United States. Some were birds of passage. That is, they came to the United States for the high wages and were intent upon returning home after earning a set amount of money or after having stayed in the United States for a set amount of time. They were reluctant to engage in any industrial disputes because they did not see a personal benefit for themselves in joining any trade union or participating in any strike. To them, the wages were great. The wages were already high enough. They were earning far more in the United States than they could in their homelands. And about half of the immigrants that came over between 1880 and 1914 eventually returned home. Now, another immigrant phenomenon was the appearance of yearly seasonal workers. After regular steamship travel had been established, the immigrants began spending part of the year in the United States to take advantage of seasonally higher wages. Now, industrial work typically ground down the immigrant families through industrial injuries and the sheer exhaustion from being overworked. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle provides a classic view of this. Immigrants were treated with suspicion because the American radicalism was influenced by these new immigrants. During the Homestead riot that we'll discuss a little later, an anarchist named Alexander Berkman shot Henry Frick. Frick was the man leading the company at the Homestead Works. Berkman had nothing to do with the strike or the factory. His actions nonetheless led to a dramatic shift in public opinion regarding the strikers. Frick survived the shooting. He survived the shooting, and he really only suffered minimal injuries. Berkman, on the other hand, was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the attack. Now, at this time, there was an intense fear and anxiety over socialism. Socialism was one of the ideas that the immigrants had brought over. In the United States, socialism really hadn't taken hold, but in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had really taken hold. And there was a great fear regarding socialists because, at least from the American point of view, it appeared that many of the socialists were atheists. But in the United States, the socialists tended to be Christian socialists. And Eugene Debs, the railroad union leader and perennial presidential candidate, was well known for equating Jesus as a socialist. He even gave speeches that implied that Jesus was against personal wealth. Speeches like the Supreme Leader Anti-Catholicism was also a major impediment to early unionizing attempts. There was a very strong prejudice against Catholics that really didn't dissipate until around the time that JFK was elected. Um, one could remember that in later in the 1930s, Al Smith was a sort of a revolutionary because he was a Catholic and he ran for president. But it was almost a foregone conclusion that Roosevelt would beat Smith because Smith was a Catholic. Anti-Catholicism was a very, very strong prejudice in the United States. They were viewed as having idolatrous and strange beliefs. Protestants were repulsed at the idea of associating with them. Race was another union impediment, as African American workers were viewed as the low men on the totem pole. They were excluded altogether and mainly served as industrial strike breakers. And again, in a reference to the Homestead strike, many of the strike breakers were African Americans, and hostilities flared up between them and the strikers. Now, this was the environment in which the unions had to develop. And we'll break our lecture here, and we'll come back to wrap up our lecture on industrial labor. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture. And I am Ted, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.